So over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to break things up into 3 sections. Firstly, we'll have the introduction, where I'll say hello. And then we'll have part 2, which is, of course, the reason why you're all here. We're going to talk about how our projects look at their planning and how we define how exactly it is that we put frameworks in place to plan on a AAA project. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the Q&A at the end. Right then, let's get to it. So, an absolute pleasure to be here. My name is Adam Lavender. I'm Studio Production and QA Manager at Ubisoft Leamington and Ubisoft Reflections. So I've been with the studio for coming up to 7 years now. And within that time, I've been fortunate enough to work on 8 AAA and projects and be involved in those as well. Within that time, I've had varying areas of focus, so things like gameplay, animation, audio, characters, the tech side of things as well. But more recently, I've been involved in the processes and the kind of project release planning for big projects as well, which of course forms the basis of this talk. So what is it that we're going to discuss? Well, I'm going to talk about how our projects approach the release planning while still in the very early stages of development, so leading up to things like HQ checkpoints. We're going to talk about the why. Why was it necessary to put frameworks like this in place in the first place? How? What were our methods? What was our strategy? And I'm going to talk about the challenges and indeed the successes that we faced along the way as well. We'll look at the various approaches, how some of them worked, how some of them didn't, and hopefully give you some food for thought as well. I'll talk you through the tools that we used to aid the release process and make things smoother, how deliverables were defined, tracked, reported on, how dependencies were raised and given that kind of appropriate level of visibility, and all of the steps involved in building this framework as well, so that you can take the ideas away and hopefully adapt them to suit your own needs. To get an idea of the framework and the size of the projects I'm talking about, we're talking about AAA projects with a large team. But the idea here is actually that the process that you'll see can be taken away and any size of team can work with it. It doesn't matter whether you're a AAA project, whether you're a mobile, large team, small team. There are learnings that you can take away. And it doesn't actually need to be the whole framework, even if it's just the finer details, like things like Jira, for example. You can tailor the framework to fit your timeline, your extended project schedules leading into the live phases. It can stretch, it can adapt. And actually, it's more about the mindset and getting into that frame of mind to start doing regular releases. Now, when I mention releases throughout the presentation, I'm talking about internal releases or milestones, if you like, as opposed to public-facing ones that go through a submission process. Okay, this is it, building an iterative framework. Firstly, defining the framework. So in this section, we'll cover a brief history of the thought process behind release planning, why it was necessary to start doing regular releases in the first place, and I'll also show you what the initial framework looked like and all of the steps involved in that as well. So on one of our projects, when we started thinking about releases, we had about 50 people on the project at the time. And the composition was very much a mixture of those who had worked together for a long time, those who hadn't worked together before, new people to the studio. So in many respects, we were deep into the forming stage of team development. Now, as you can imagine, for a project still in its very early phases and working parallel to things like HQ checkpoints, there's quite a tight focus towards those things. But of course, not everybody on the project is going to be involved in those kind of initiatives. We also have efforts going on towards pre-production and various other pieces of development as well. So the question becomes, what does everybody not working towards HQ checkpoints focus on? You tend to have a lot of people working on stuff, and all of that stuff is cool, but you need a way to glue it all together. And actually, this is where the regular releases come in. So the thinking was that on our projects, releases come at some point in the future anyway. So why not make an effort and start on them early before you've got a full development team on board? And you can give a focus to all of the non-HQ related efforts or publisher related efforts, depending on your organization. So the model that we used was to implement quarterly releases lasting 3 months at a time. So it gives you a total of 4 per year. And the idea behind each release is that it has a defined set of pillars. i.e. all of the things that you're going to develop and deliver within a given time frame. And then these form the basis of the next release, and you build on them over time, and eventually you've got your full product. So to make these releases happen, we needed a framework, and this is the first iteration of that framework. As you can see, it's split into 2 phases. So you have phase 1 for development, phase 1 for planning rather, phase 2 for development. Within the planning phase, you have your planning workshop, and we'll talk about that next. Then you have your kickoff, which is when you start development. Of course, games projects work largely with agile teams, so we have our sprints. And then after all of the sprints are finished, we have closing. And the closing period effectively yields 2 things. So you have the release of the build in the form of a playtest, and you have the accompanying release report. And then what happens is that the cycle begins again. So take note of this, because we'll refer back to this as the talk goes on, and we'll see how the framework evolved during each iteration. Okay, so with the framework in place, it's time to begin release 1. So here we're going to talk about the planning of that first release and how exactly we defined what it would become. And we'll talk about heading into development for the very first time, how we unified our efforts with new things such as a new sprint cadence and different reporting mechanisms, and how we measured the progress of these as well with things like health checks. And then we'll also cover the approach to closing and actually releasing the build. So at the start, you essentially need to figure out what it is that's going into your build. And so one of the mechanisms that we have is a planning workshop. The intention here is to bring together representatives from disciplines across the project. So you're looking at production, direction, art, tech, world, whatever it might be. We've brought together people for a workshop that has lasted 2 days. The overall goal being that as a group, you define what it is that your release will become. The focus here is very much outside of anything that's related to the HQ checkpoints that I mentioned earlier on. So from the workshop, the aim is to come out with a list of things that you're going to develop and deliver within that release. Everything is to have a priority. You need to have your assignees, identify dependencies where possible. Who's the work fall under, who are the leads in each different cell. And then after all of this, you kind of aim to be in a position where you know exactly what your release will become. And the expectation after the planning workshop is that groups such as associate producers or whoever your project managers are in your respective companies, they go away, they produce a fully estimated breakdown of the work with their teams, and then they come back at the end, and then that is what you develop and deliver. So for the very first time, you have everybody working towards the same release schedule. Now, for the first day of the workshop, you do things such as reviewing the business needs, the requirements for HQ, the requirements for the project, the high-level roadmap for the very first time. And the idea here is that you do this because you don't want there to be any surprises. You want to get a shared understanding of what it is that you're trying to achieve as a group, so that you can feed into the bigger picture of the project. You review the release schedule, the high-level plan, and you recap the goals as well. Now, with everybody up to speed as to what it is that you're trying to achieve, we had an activity with all of the members of the workshop. And so the idea here is that you get everybody to write down on Post-it notes their top 5 things that they want to see developed and delivered within that release. You have about 20 minutes to do this, and then afterwards, everybody puts them all up on the wall. And then you discuss the things that come up the most. And these help form the basis of the priorities. And then you can have meaningful discussions about all of these things and to see whether the priorities are correct, whether the deliverables that have been proposed are actually feasible and make sense, and also try and identify dependencies as well. The activity itself is quite important because what it does is it helps put the power into people's hands rather than it just being a case that production come along and say, hey, you need to do all of these things because we said so. Day 2 is very much more of the same, except here the focus is more about refining your commitments from the day before, making sure that you're being ambitious yet realistic. Everything has owners, everything has a priority. You've identified your dependencies where you can, and ultimately that you still have that shared understanding of what you're trying to achieve. At the end of the workshop, you should have that list of things that you want to make within the release. And then you send the APs away with their respective teams, and they begin breaking down the work, and they do this before development kicks off. Now on new projects, for example, while the breakdowns are still happening, you need to do things like fine-tune the day-to-day of the project. One particular example can cover 3 major topics. So we have Jira, we have the sprint cadence, and we have regular reporting mechanisms as well. Now, the first topic to discuss is Jira. So using new instances essentially means that you have a blank slate for your project. And because of that, there's, of course, going to be a lot of unanswered questions. So one of the things that we've done is to get all of the associate producers together to discuss best practices from experience on previous projects. We talk about how boards should work, what issue types are, how fixed versions and milestones should work in Jira, even down to things such as naming conventions and profile pictures. There's, of course, a lot of stuff to discuss. Now, eventually, we do things like organizing this into a Jira code of use, and we actually have one of these that's up on one of our confluences. And this is really, really useful, and actually brings us to the first top tip. So document as you go along. It's super important. And having documentation, it's always handy to refer back to. And it's handy when it comes to onboarding new people to the project, new partners. And even things like Jira, for example. If you document how you want to use this and get an idea before any development starts of how you want to use your tools or different project software, project management software, whatever it might be, getting firmed up on this is only going to benefit you and save you a potential headache and a lot of questions in the future as well. So on to the second major topic is the sprint cadence. And once again, in an effort to glue together lots of stuff. Now, we've seen before an example where we've had developers working on the project who've been doing sprints that have lasted Monday to Monday or Wednesday to the following Wednesday, some 1 week, some 2 weeks, some 3 week. And that's kind of okay. But the problem with that is it's hard to align and have a known calendar of events when things are likely to come in. So where possible, it's kind of important that teams align towards a unified sprint cadence. It doesn't have to be the golden rule, because of course some teams might benefit from working with a different cadence, whether it's 3 weeks and everyone else does 2, as long as it kind of feeds into the bigger picture of the project. An example being is this particular one. So this is a sprint that lasts 2 weeks, so it's made up of 10 working days. And the idea being is that you schedule your sprint to start on the first Monday and finish on the second Friday. And it means that you can monitor progress through the 2 weeks and adjust as necessary. And your project managers, in our case, associate producers, should be scheduling the work and filling up 10 days worth of work based on any scope versus capacity guidelines. And then they would also send out reports as well. And that brings us to major topic 3. And also the second top tip, create visibility and transparency. One of the things that we've introduced on projects is actually sprint reports. So sprint start, mid-sprint, sprint end, so 3 reports in total. All templated and filled in again by the associate producers. The idea here is that they give that visibility and that transparency on what exactly is being planned for the sprint. They go out to the whole game team, and they're useful because it's bullet points. It basically says, hey, we're going to aim to get these tasks done within the time frame of the sprint. And so team A could send that report out, and team B could look at that and go, okay, we find this stuff interesting because we might have dependencies on some of these, and it just gives that better visibility across the board that I've already mentioned. On those reports as well, you can include various things like scope versus capacity figures so that you can see over time in the 3 different reports whether things are likely to slip or not, depending on whether people are overscoped. Okay, so here in all of its glory is the release schedule for release 1. This was comprised of a 2-week planning phase that had the planning workshop within it. Afterwards, we had our sprints, so 4 sprints made up of 2 weeks each. Then we have the closing period, which we'll talk about later on. We have the development kickoff, which again is just the first day of development, the first day of sprint 1. Then we have health checks, and then we have a marker for our build delivery as well. And again, this schedule is publicly available on different Confluence pages so that you can have that visibility and that transparency. So if you imagine that everybody has gone away, they've done their planning, following on from the workshop. So now that they know what it is that they need to develop and deliver, we essentially need a way to make that known. So for the releases, we have used a table in Confluence to make all of this information available. Now, the process was that the associate producers, as the owners on the project management side of the deliverables, they essentially add the information to this page. So it's fairly self-explanatory, things like a high-level description. You've got the key contacts on there, so lead, the AP, an idea of the priority, a Jira link, and some statuses as well that are important later on because they feed into various reporting mechanisms. The idea with the table is that it's a live representation of the release and the progress towards delivering it. So APs have the ability to edit these pages. So as time goes on, what you actually start to see when the release progresses is the status is changing regularly. And as a constant, they would always be updated after every health check. Now, the health checks, they're essentially a chance for us to regularly measure the health as that progress goes on throughout development. So that you can essentially course correct, kind of in the agile mindset, right? Don't leave things till the end. Course correct as you go along so that you avoid a nasty surprise. Now, there are a given number of health checks per release, as you've just seen on the release schedule, and they usually take place after each development sprint. They come in the form of a meeting with the associate producers, again, as the owners of the deliverables on the production side. APs have a meeting together, and they essentially say, right, here are my deliverables, here's the state that they're currently in. And those status updates are then compiled into a report, which goes out, again, the report, which you'll see in a second, visibility, transparency on the project and on all of the progress. Now, to measure the health, there are a set number of statuses that you can choose from. As you can see here, these are intended to cover every status eventuality in a clear and concise way. Again, all detailed on Confluence, along with a how-to guide. It's on the deliverable owners, in this case the APs, to update the deliverables table ahead of the health check meeting. And so once the table has been updated, it looks a little bit like this. So you can see that one of the deliverables here is resolved, and there's a supporting comment to say why. And the Jira has been resolved as well. And there would, of course, be more information in the Jira. This is intended to be very, very high level. So here we can see an example of a health check report. So in essence, it's comprised of 2 slides, and these visualize the data from the health checks and all of those statuses based on the statuses. The image on the left, you can see some charts that kind of visualize the percentage split between the deliverables based on those statuses. So you can see that 24% have been resolved by the time of this health check, and 46% of them are on track. The image on the right, you can see the progression of the release over time, and that's just in the form of a line graph. And actually, having these figures is really useful because what it means is that you have an indication of where you might land in terms of overall delivery for your release, and you can actually estimate the velocity of the deliverables as time goes on. This report would, again, go out to the game team, transparency, visibility. Now, everything I'm going to talk to you about from this point onwards happened during the start of the global pandemic, so towards the shift from working from home. The only reason to mention this is just to say that whether you're having a kind of hybrid working model, whether people are working from home, whether people are entirely in the studio, it doesn't really matter. You can still do your releases. It does work. Now, as mentioned before, at the end of the release schedule, we have the closing period. In essence, this is a 2-week hardening sprint. The idea here is that you actually move away from any task work and towards the wrapping up of the build. So things like must-fix bugs, stability, director feedback, and any kind of polish as well. And the closing period ends with the playtest and the release report. Now, in order to package up builds for the release, you need to assemble a team. So you want people like Live, for example, who can be there to coordinate the playtest, people from online, in case there's any kind of back-end infrastructure or servers that might need spinning up, production to wrangle things together, and then QA to ensure the stability of the build. And then this team is responsible for giving the build that green light and that go when it's ready to go. Now, the strategy for closing down, for the most part, is driven by QA. Of course, you have your normal locks whereby you shouldn't have anything else being checked into the build, and QA are kind of the gatekeepers of that, right? So they're making sure that the must-fix bugs, they've all been checked in, they've been tested. And once all of this is done and final lock has passed, the release team should come together, and if they can, and the build is okay, they'll give it a go, green light it, upload it, and then you'll be able to get your hands on the build for the very first time. Now, to track progress of the closing periods, we have things like daily battle status reports. They're kind of similar to the health check reports, except here you're essentially measuring the remaining amount of issues that are left on a milestone or a fixed version. The idea being that you hit 0 issues at the end of the given lock dates. These just go out in the form of an email to the game team, and they begin at the start of the closing period and they end at the end of the closing period. All of these figures can be pulled from things like Jira, for example. You can essentially set up things like filters that would give you these figures. And actually, they're quite useful, because if you're doing things like including names on there of people that might have bugs that are assigned to them, it's good because the APs or the production people can wrangle together and say, hey, you've got a bug on you. Let's aim to get this. Let's aim to get this fixed and resolved as quickly as possible. So it's not about saying, hey, you've still got a bug on you, you're in trouble. It's more about kind of pushing things along. In addition to this, we have things like daily must-fix calls as well that happen between QA and production. And the idea is that you review bugs in the morning, and anything that's super, super critical, you try and get resolved, hopefully on the same day. So on the production side, as development should have ended by the closing period, because of course you've moved away from any tasks and any development and towards the bug fixing, the deliverable owners, so the APs in our case, need to go back to this table, and they need to provide the final status update on everything that has been delivered under their ownership. So they can choose from done, not done, and partially complete. And of course, all of the relevant admin happens in Jira or any other project management software as well. Now, to complement the release and to be able to share the final update, not just with the game team, but perhaps external stakeholders such as studio management or HQ or a publisher, whomever it might be, we have the release report. And this is used to give you a kind of prettier and portable package, if you like. So all of the APs were sent a slide to fill out. It somewhat mirrors what's on the Confluence page and what's in Jira, except the idea here is essentially to put release notes, to put build notes on there that say, okay, this was our initial goal. Here's the description of that. And here are all of the things that we have done. And you can include things as well, like links to cool stuff, whether it be a camera link to somewhere in the actual build, whether it's a video, whether it's documentation, images, whatever it might be. The idea is that the slides should be easily understandable and digestible by anybody that reads them, so that you can essentially look and go, oh, hey, this team has made something that looks good. Isn't that cool? After all of the slides have been provided, they get compiled into the kind of wider release report. And this just includes things that you'd likely expect to see from most reports, right? So there's an example of an index up there. You've got the bulk of the release report, which of course is those slides that we've just talked about. You have information about the upcoming release as well. Perhaps it's the release schedule for your next milestone. And then things like a pie chart that says, hey, here is the final status of the release. And of course, you have your playtest as well. You can all get your hands on the build together. That's always a fun time. So on to release 2. Now, in this section, it's worth mentioning that we're not going to discuss the release per se, but what we're doing here is actually discussing how the framework has changed from the previous release and where the first lot of iterations come in. Now, again, on one of our projects, there are some interesting developments that you might face. An example being that you could have an early roll-on of team members. You could have new partners that are coming onto projects, whatever it might be. And of course, we're all aware of the pandemic as well. So you could potentially have to move everything to a virtually remote setting, which I'm sure applies to most of us, if not all of us here. One of the biggest points for Release 2 is actually to find a way to get the directors more involved. We knew that with one build already behind us, there was a chance to review what it was that we'd already done, review the outcomes, to better inform our decisions about what it was that we were going to do this time around. And of course, with the addition of new people as well, you need a method to better break up the work. And to do this, you can add 3 more steps. You have the director briefs, the management build review, and the breakouts as well. So I'll leave that up there just for a second. Okay. So in order to get directors more involved, we introduced the director brief slides. The idea here is that each director adds their wishes onto it and says, okay, here's what I want at a very high level. And with that is the accompanying acceptance criteria. And those are the bullet points that you would have to hit in order to fulfill that deliverable. And once all of the briefs come through from the directors, they'll be taken into the newly introduced management build review with the directors, with the project producers, where they'll be discussed, check priorities, check feasibility, check the acceptance criteria. And then afterwards, they get sent across to all of the leads and then the wider team ahead of the planning workshops that take place, so that you can get an idea of what's being requested by direction in advance. Now, once again, we had another workshop, very much the same as before, except this time with a lot more people and entirely remotely. But you go through, again, you prioritize, you sanity check, and then at the end of it, you come out with a list of things that you're going to develop and deliver. In an example where you have an influx of people and new core roles that are filled, chances are there's more structure within the game team. So what it means in this example is that planning can actually be broken up into individual areas, with each team feeding into the framework as necessary. So after the workshop, this is what happened, and I'll show you how next. But of course, not forgetting anybody that isn't in the leads, production, and direction groups. While developers are busy figuring out, whilst those people are figuring out what the release is going to become, developers need something else to do, right? So we added a connecting sprint for developers to feed into. And you can use it for the wrapping up of any work that might have slipped from the previous release. You can fix bugs, write documentation, record videos, whatever it might be. And this actually aligns with the dates of the planning weeks, so that everybody on the project can then feed back into the next release straight afterwards. So with more people comes more stuff to deliver, and you need a way to make these things known across the board. So introducing another slide, specifically one again for production owners of deliverables to fill out. The idea here is that you say what it is that you're going to deliver, what the acceptance criteria to hit that deliverable is. So kind of similar to the director brief slides, except this is when you've gone away and you've taken that director brief and gone, okay, here's what we actually can do. You've got the key contacts on here, you've got the priority, confidence levels, based on your scope versus capacity planning. When is it likely to arrive? Is it month 1? Is it month 2? Is it month 3? And then all of these slides get compiled into what's known as the pillars document. And this essentially details everything that is planned for the release. And then it's shared with the whole game team, and you can refer back to it whenever you need to. And the purpose of the document is to say, hey, here's the release, here's what it might become. And they also help to form the basis of the health checks as well, because you can check the progress against your acceptance criteria, and then of course the release report to say what was delivered against what was initially planned. A minor update for the release report, there was the addition of the comparison of delivery from release to release. It's just in the form of a line graph, but actually it's quite useful in visualizing that, and you can see how you're getting on. Have you done better than the previous release? Have you done about the same? Have you done worse? Again, visibility and transparency. Now, full disclaimer, this section was originally called Third Time's the Charm, but I had a bit too much fun with all of the icons in the presentation. So when I told my fiance that I wanted to find a way to get a dinosaur in there, it took a whole 0.5 seconds after she'd said, get Jeff Goldblum in there somewhere, that his picture was on screen and there was a dinosaur icon, so you're welcome for that. But in all seriousness, I've actually called it Life Finds a Way, because by the time we got to release 3, we were actually in a much better place. We were really in the swing of things, and we found that it was the tiny adjustments and tiny improvements that made such a difference. So we found that the main release pages where the deliverables table was, they can continue to be a good source of information. The health checks were good, the subsequent reports were good, and we had the slides as well. They're a bit of a pain, and we'll talk about that at the end, but they still created the pretty package that we needed. Okay, so in the very last section, we'll review the last iteration of the release framework and go through some of those smaller changes that actually made such a big difference. Okay, so 2 major framework changes for release 3 were that the management build review, get rid of that, and also planning workshop, you can get rid of that as well. When you've got a bigger team on board on your project and you have that structure, maybe area producers that look after each area of the project, planning can now take place in each of those individual areas in accordance with the individual priorities and perhaps what the relevant directors in those areas would like to see. So if you keep it as one meeting, i.e. planning workshop, it's just not going to scale. 40 to 50 people, it's not good. So director briefs still happen, but just in each area instead. And what it actually means is that the rest of the framework remains the same, and that within each area, because you don't have to kind of go into the management build review, and planning is taking place in each of these areas, everybody just feeds back into the project. So the breakouts are still happening there, and actually it's quite a big step, because what it means by this point is that you have way more understanding about what it is that you're trying to do in terms of planning and processes, and things are usually more successful because of the fact that they're better understood. And what you actually see as well is that people tend to get a head start on the planning for the next release because they know what it is that's coming. So it's a much more organic process. Okay, so back to the pillar slides. Very much the same as before, except here you can see the addition of the previous build marker. The idea with this is that you say whether something is new for that particular release or whether it has come from the releases before. And it means that you can ask questions, and it gives an indication to others of the background of this work. So has it been around for 2 releases? Why? Is it bigger than expected? Is it a harder piece of work than expected? And it just helps you to get an idea of that bigger picture. One of the things we struggled with right at the start was actually the tracking and reporting of dependencies. We kind of just talked about them, called them out on the pillar slides, and then never really talked about them again. And that's not great, right? Because you need to be able to mitigate all of your dependencies and all of your risks. So what you can do is you can create a simple Kanban board in something like Jira. The idea here is that production can go and they can flag something as an impediment, maybe in the form of a task. And you essentially say, hey, I am blocked by this thing. And it means that the associate producers can go away and start a dialogue with the relevant people. And it's really as simple as that. And actually having the board also serves as a reminder that dependencies still exist. And it helps affirm that mindset that these things require constant attention. So the trick there is not to forget that the dependency board exists, because it's easy enough to do. So definitely worth making one of these for yourselves. Okay, with more people comes more data, comes more admin. The confidence pages and the tables for the deliverables that I told you about earlier on, they become a pain. As you've got more people, you're finding that with that data becomes slow loading times on things like Confluence. It also means that APs or whomever it is that's updating these pages, they're having to manually re-enter stuff a lot. We found that we actually had 3 sources of truth by this point. And it was a big learning to take away. So the three sources of truth were the pillars document, so the PowerPoint slide, the conference page, and Jira as well. So information quickly goes out of date, and people don't really like updating various pieces of sources of truth, and it's understandable why. So what we did here was to utilize Jira and automate things a little, kind of moving away from analog and into digital, if you like. What we did was add a tick box to high-level issues in Jira. So you can tick something as a deliverable, and what it would do is it would show up on the release page. So rather than having to manually enter it, you can essentially do that. You can also add things like the health checks as well, rather than having to update that manually. And then the release notes, which help inform the live team of what it is that's gone into the build. So that is nearly it. So a recap of the takeaways before we finish. Document as you go along. It's super, super important. Information and communication of that information is absolutely key to success. With your framework, remember that you can only do your best to build it with a project in mind, and do the thing that's going to benefit your project the most. But also remember that you can't please everybody as well, but be prepared to act on any feedback. Figure out what tools you're going to use, whether it be something like Jira or PowerPoint for whatever mechanisms you have, and automate things if possible. If I were to do this again, there is no way that I would use PowerPoint because it is a pain to get a lot of stuff updated. Probably a poor choice now that I reflect on it. And be clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve as well, and how everybody should feed into the process. Remember, transparency, visibility, and be sure to adapt the framework to your project as well and fit it to whatever needs you have. I'm not sure whether we have any time left. We good? Yeah? We've got some time for questions if there are. We've got 5 minutes. Any questions? Go for it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the chat was great. Yeah, I was just reflecting on the plan. You said how you do like play tests at the end of each sprint, I think. I was just wondering, what do you do in like cases of sometimes there's a big bug that was missed, like unforeseen circumstances, if there's a couple of people who feel like the build was really bad, like unplayable, and obviously it has like a domino effect on the rest of the team. Like, what do you do in those situations where like things haven't gone to plan for?
Things that are unplanned. Sorry, I didn't hear you too well. So the question is, what do you do in the situation where you have things like bugs that can't be fixed and things that slip?
Yeah, just like so where it has like a domino effect on the rest of the team. And
I suppose it depends on the circumstance. That's a really good question. It's about looking at least on the production side, it's about looking at what is feasible. If you don't have the correct people in the studio to fix it at the time, whether they're sick or whether they're away, you have to adjust. The wrong thing to do would be to try and push a fix through and work people to death to try and get something in there. That just wouldn't be the right approach. So what you should do instead is adjust and say, okay, if we don't have the resource or the time or the means to fix something, what can we do instead? Can we remove something from the build? Can we actually adjust the date? Does it make sense to do so? All of those kind of things. But yeah, not to push things through. Cool.
So you said that at the end of a release, you have like a closing sprint where you wrap up the release, followed by another opening sprint where you do the sprint planning. Mm-hmm. How do you keep the rest of the team directed and motivated when they can have up to 4 weeks where they're not working towards any particular release or milestone?
In the planning phase, that's a good question, and actually we found that was a thing because of course once you've got to the point where you're doing a 2-week closing period and then you're doing the 2-week planning phase, what do people do, especially if they don't have the development work? That was quite tricky at the start because exactly what you've just said. What do people do? But actually towards the end, once the framework is better understood, the leads and the APs are able to find stuff from your existing backlogs that perhaps hadn't been done or marked for the release that you've just accomplished, or maybe even not planned for the next one, and just pick from there, and also just look at other meaningful pieces of work as well. We wanted to create an environment where it wasn't just the case that we would say, okay, here are the absolute things that you have to do. We wanted to empower the developers and everybody else on the project to be able to say, okay, might not have something to do right now, but what about this? Give people the option to prototype, give people the option to work on various things that they wanted to, and they can, help decide whether something is meaningful or not. Just it. Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of documentation, you said keep the documentation. Do you ever use Word, or is it only everything on Confluence? And also, you said you automate some of it through Jira. Is there any other way of automating it?
So the automation that we had was purely based on the deliverables, right? So we shifted away from the Confluence page because, like I said, it just didn't scale after a while, and we had multiple sources of truth. So in terms of the physical task work that was being done, that was all in Jira, and then automated so that it pulled automatically into the Confluence page. And those are your development tasks, right? And alongside that, you have the release notes, which we added to, which help inform the live team at the end. In terms of the other mechanisms as well, it kind of depends. So Confluence is the main thing that we would use for our projects, and have that kind of one source of truth for here's all of the project documentation. But it depends what people want to do. People can add Word documents onto there, for example, but we'd usually point people towards Confluence. All done? I think we're all done. Cool. If you see me around, feel free to grab me if you've got any more questions. Otherwise, my email's up on there. Thank you very much for listening. Very much appreciated. Thank you.